So when I think about the question of dance in visual art contexts, I keep returning to the Yvonne Rainer exhibition at Raven Row Gallery in East London last summer as the moment when everything changed. Or perhaps the moment when I realised that everything had changed. So there are two standout memories for me from that exhibition. And the first was running into a curator, a visual art curator I know, who was incredibly enthusiastic about the show and how much he loved dance and how enthralled he is by it. And he was telling me that this was the case from when he was a child, and actually that he had always harboured a secret wish, a secret ambition to be a dancer. Which he was kind of slightly bashfully sharing with me, but the huge enthusiasm just kind of shone out. So the other moment was sitting in the lower gallery just before the penultimate performances. So as part of the show, there was a programme of 4 performance works by Yvonne Rainer, so trio A, chair pillow, diagonal and talking solo. And they were performed, I think, 3 times a day. I'm looking at people who would know, yeah. So on that penultimate performance, I think it was on the Sunday, Anna de Keersmacher was in the front row. And there was this kind of incredible excitement that this famous person was in such close proximity. So Anna de Keersmacher, the Belgian choreographer, who's the director of Roses, Dance Roses, and quite well known because Beyoncé ripped off one of her videos, so we know her for that reason. But actually it was like Madonna or Beyoncé was there, kind of this famous person sitting in the front row. It almost felt like a fashion show, this front row of a fashion show. And in fact, I will confess that I either put it on Facebook or I tweeted it and said, I'm sitting at Raven Row with Anna de Keersmacher sitting in the front row. I feel like I'm at a kind of Givenchy show in Paris, this big moment. And so the association with a fashion show, I think, actually is very pertinent in the sense that in that moment, it was apparent about how fashionable dance had become. So the philosopher Giorgio Agamben wrote a really lovely article, What is the Contemporary? And he references fashion as the example par excellence of the contemporary. So as soon as it appears, as soon as it's apparent, it's gone. And in that moment at the Yvonne Rainer show, I was really struck by how now it's okay to love dance, to be enthusiastic and excited about it. And I had the sense how things had really shifted, that the currency had changed. Dance had arrived, and it was contemporary. So my name is Joe Moran, and I'm a choreographer based in London and an associate artist with Dance4. And I've been invited to offer a provocation on the situation of dance within the gallery and museum. And as part of the event, an encounter point to these very subjective thoughts that I'm going to share with you. I'm also sharing my durational performance work, Singular, which is performed today by my colleagues Helke and Rosalie. So in this presentation, this provocation, I'm going to talk you through 3 things. Firstly, I'm going to talk about this work, Singular, and how it speaks to my understanding of what dance can offer in the gallery or museum context. Secondly, I'm going to think about the opportunities and perhaps try and wade through some of the problems and tensions of the relationship between dance and the visual arts in order to look at where we are now, which I think is hopeful. I think it's a hopeful and exciting moment where more is possible. Then lastly, and perhaps this is the moment of provocation in the talk, I'm going to draw upon some theoretical ideas about contemporary art and to ask whether dance's acceptance into the visual art world in fact signals a loss of dance's political and historical potency. So the ethos in which I'm approaching this talk is the possibility of, together, thinking beyond what we already know. So on my behalf and in dialogue with the panel and the audience, with each of you, I'm interested in the possibility of an invitation for us to move beyond just an exchange of our opinions, of things that we already know, towards perhaps thinking together and collectively moving our thoughts forward. I have been to a million talks on dance and the visual arts. I'm sure everyone has. And I've been to so many talks where I feel like it's only getting going as you get to the end. So my hope is that maybe this provocation may we can hit the ground running, but let's see what happens. So the first thing, talking about this piece, Singular. So the first place to start... This is an experiment. I've never done a presentation on provocation in relation to this work. And I'm interested what it might be like to sit them together. I'm also interested in the possibility that this work may destabilize this presentation. And perhaps that may reflect some of the possibility or the potential of dance within the gallery to kind of disrupt a frame that we know. So the invitation for you and for me is to kind of move between my presentation, my provocation, and this durational performance work, the different modes that they are. So perhaps we might have shifting awarenesses, or we may practice something we practice in dance a lot. We may be practicing kind of multiple awarenesses at once. So how I understand this work in relation to the visual arts. So Singular is a durational performance work that is created to sit outside the temporality of the theatre or theatrical time. It does not have a beginning or an end, and it's not concerned with a kind of sense of theatrical climax or development. It wasn't conceived to be presented in a gallery, but its temporality does lend itself well to the open-ended time frame of the gallery. And it's also been shown quite often in these contexts. It's also work with which I've been involved. It's also work that I have involved in my current collaboration with the sculptor Eva Rothschild, who's joining the panel today. And the costumes are Eva's instigation that she created with her colleague Ilse Kolsel, and the floor sculpture is Eva's work. So Eva and I have been talking about working together, a collaboration for the last year and a half, and we decided the way to start our collaboration, which we did last week with Fig2 and Block Universe at the ICA, was to put our works in, just put them up against each other. We called the show a setup. And the intention was to kind of test out what it might mean to work together and bring our practices, choreographic and sculptural concerns, into dialogue, to look at the kind of meeting points, but also the tensions. And from there, we're going to work forward into exploring the creation of a collaborative work. So the thing to reflect on that we've brought today is the floor sculpture, which really is the kind of the meeting point between our practices. So it's the one moment in the work that we've done where very much the kind of dance is agitating or informing the sculptural work and vice versa. And then the costumes were an experiment. So the concerns of this piece, it addresses one of the central concerns in my work, which is a wish to destabilize notions of representation, which is something I sometimes describe as who, what, and how we may be, in an attempt to suggest or implicate something which maybe exceeds representation. So questioning or unsettling dominant ideas of what a person or a body should be. And for me, in my practice, I see this widening of possibilities to have a very political potential. So with Singular, the performers are working with highly specific choreographic directives, the intention of which is to problematize and complicate their subjectivities, and their negotiation of a perceptual and conceptual puzzle, which is generative, so it keeps going. So in the performance, they are practicing the possibility of a single consciousness embodied in more than one form. It's the same thought, the same feeling, the same idea, the same intention. It's the same thing. It may look the same, and at times it will. It may not look the same, but it is the same thing. Letting go of initiating, letting go of following. Letting go of making choices to simply allow the same thing to occur simultaneously. Staying close, traveling, letting go of getting stuck in one place. Letting go of pausing, of hesitation or reconsideration to simply allow the same thing to occur simultaneously. It's not a duet. I'm not relating. I'm simply practicing the possibility of a single consciousness embodied in more than one form. Noticing where I am to let go of where I am. It's here and it's gone. 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 Letting go of myself to simply allow the same thing to occur simultaneously. And so in the performance, we know and we see it's two performers. Today it's Helke and Rosalie. It's two individuals. And yet there's the possibility of a more complicated state being implicated. So we might implicate something that we can't represent, perhaps. So in my work, I'm often trying to address these ideas through the idea of complicating the dancer's subjectivity or disrupting how we see the body. So if I move us on to the second part of my presentation, thinking about opportunities of dance in the gallery and problems and tensions, kind of tough stuff. So for us in dance, we've been really excited and fascinated by the potential of the gallery. So things that probably are very familiar to us, so I maybe won't spend a lot of time thinking about them, but just the proposition of different temporal concerns, different kind of time context, also a different proximity and relationship to an audience, and situating dance in relation to a different art history, so perhaps from the theatre into fine art, and its attendant critical frames, its critical frameworks and ways of seeing. And there's also perhaps a financial incentive for us as dance artists. So the perception that perhaps in the visual arts there is a context that's more critically astute or critically open than perhaps the UK dance touring market. So perhaps those artists who are wanting to engage more critically can see the visual arts as a context, as a compelling context perhaps, in which there can be greater engagement and perhaps sustainability of their practice. that's some of the things we're attracted to. And the fabulous spaces as well. So the problems that we've encountered or that have been experienced, again, things that we're probably all very familiar with. Dance as an add-on, a marketing tool, a way to engage audiences, or entertainment for events, for a gala or a drinks event. The sense of engaging an audience with this live encounter. So dance being this kind of instrumental intervention. Or dance being constricted to being a response to a visual artwork. So again, they're in a kind of in an auxiliary form rather than on its own terms. Dance not being given the value or informed care that it needs. So traditionally, although this is changing radically, but traditionally in visual art contexts, not being used to housing live performing artists. And so issues and lists that we have become very familiar with, so economic or labour issues, conditions of work, what's needed, the care and infrastructure that's needed for the live performance, and the list goes on. Also, the idea that dance is seen as the kind of lowly poor relation without kind of equal critical or academic acumen. So when we do the performance singular in galleries, it's often, well, we've just experimented last week with the full 6-hour duration, and the dancers are in teams. They relay. So what's just happened is the dancers have left the space, and where we would show that in a gallery, another would have a transition moment, which we find very exciting, that moment. It's a kind of a bit like Back to the Future. If they stay on too long together, they cancel each other out. So we felt we wanted to draw the dance out at this point, to not be like a kind of backing dancers to this presentation. So the problems. When we think of the problems of dance in the gallery, often the challenge or confrontation to the visual arts, by which I really mean the visual art institution, the gallery or the museum, is to engage in an informed and thoughtful way, a more profound way with dance as an art form, both practically but also critically. And to be frank, there has been a considerable learning process that's been needed from the visual art institutions, and that's I think very much happening. And the Who Cares book that is being presented today, it has really documented that, I think, really well. So conversely, in terms of the challenge to dance, often dance's engagement in the visual art context has been questioned. So, or perhaps better said, its lack of engagement with the terms, the concerns, or the history of the gallery and the museum. So in that way, we can think of how dance, perhaps we can think of dance as occupant, just landing itself into a gallery as if it were a stage. So criticisms have been raised about whether dance is really thinking about that context, and it's an opportunity. So I'd love to just shift this idea of problems on a little bit further by thinking about a kind of the power dynamics at play, and maybe drawing reference to the idea or the notion of cultural appropriation or reappropriation. So I think in that kind of nub of problems, certainly from the dance perspective, has been the experience that this more powerful legitimizing art form of the visual arts, this legitimate academy can kind of pick up or throw away, can say what is valid or not. So in that sense, I'm going to just share a definition of the idea of cultural appropriation, which I've taken from everydayfeminism.com. I was reading a really interesting article on it yesterday. So it's quite grand to make this claim of dance as this kind of subjugated thing, but I think this idea is useful. So so cultural appropriation, the power dynamic in which members of a dominant culture take elements from a culture of people who have been systematically oppressed by that dominant culture. So I think in dance we often feel that way, that we are being, or we have felt that way, we are being appropriated. If we think about, often this is, I think, said about photography or video art, you know, the visual art world just thought, yes, we want that, we'll have it, we'll take it, and we'll throw you away. So the members of that community is kind of expunged from the economy, the equation, and then we'll do what we want with it. So very different to an idea of cultural exchange. So where peoples share mutually with each other, and that kind of cultural exchange lacks that systemic power dynamic. And then again, the idea of assimilation, so where the marginalized community takes on elements of that dominant culture in order to try and attain some of those benefits. And just as a thought, and maybe something we can pick up later, I wonder if part of the criticism of dance, you've come in here and you haven't thought about what this frame is a kind of challenge to dance that it's failed to assimilate to the dominant ideology of the visual art context. Perhaps. So just some examples of appropriation. I'm sure we know this all very familiar with this idea, but perhaps just focusing in on that idea that the marginalized group is expunged from the equation. So Madonna, Vogue, she's back again as a reference. So that the whole kind of voguing movement from the 80s, really beautifully documented in Paris's Burning, is something that Madonna picked up. And the transgender or the transsexual dancer or expunged from that. You know, the video, the pop song, and it's all Madonna and her dancers. And perhaps there is a discourse around kind of gay or queer, but the transgender or the transsexual is removed. And multiple examples, many contemporary examples, this emergence of this notion of transracial that's happening at the moment, or cultural appropriation. But then in art, we can think of the kind of ethnic art as it was appropriated in the modernist movement and extensively. So we're familiar with that idea. But the idea that the marginalized group is expunged, I think we've seen a lot historically with the visual artist as choreographer. So instance where the visual artist is taking the choreographic practice from dance, and the knowledge or the authorship of the dance artist or the collaborating choreographer is expunged from it's rendered invisible in that discourse, or in those instances. But I wonder, perhaps, if things are changing. If that moment I noticed at the Raven Row show is signalling perhaps a shift from appropriation to exchange. André Lepecki, a fantastic dance theorist and writer and curator, has reflected its curious and still rather under-theorized phenomenon that dance over the past decade, and this is him writing in the Whitechapel publication Dance, which I think was 2013, 12, 13. So over the past decade, dance has become a crucial reference for thinking, making, and curating visual and performance-based art. So I would reflect that perhaps we are taking a shift from appropriation to exchange, that dance is arriving as a contemporary art form, and it is being recognized. I'm making a lot of noise with this. It's being recognized by the visual arts as having a powerful and active critical discourse. And there are so many exhibitions that are attesting to this, and I think it's really over the last 5 or 6 years. So exhibitions such as Signs, Figures, Character Signs and Figures at Tate, the Move exhibition, Choreographing You, and the Digital Archive, which is from the Hayward, Take Tanks, the Whitechapel publication I just mentioned. Tino Segal's work, but he doesn't identify in dance or choreography, but does have that background, the live event. Sarah Mitchelson winning the biennial Whitney in 2012, a choreographer in New York. And then the retrospective of Xavier Loire at MoMA, Yvonne Rayner at Raven Row, and of course then
Boris Charmat's Musée de la Danse at Tate Modern.
So we're now in a new time, perhaps, I think, when dance has achieved its position as this viable contemporary art form. And that's
a hopeful and optimistic moment. I think it's still something we are kind of transitioning through, but in my own practice, for example, in my work with Eva, I'm very much having an experience of an exchange rather than a kind of unequal power dynamic at play. So in this moment, I think there are loads of possibilities, and I'm just going to list a few here, and perhaps we might be able to add to them or unpack them. But possibilities of dance and choreography to complicate and perhaps reimagine the visual art context. So one area that's something I'm very interested in is the idea of curation as a choreographic practice, and has been explored the Choreographed Exhibition. So in a sense, thinking of something of expanded choreographic practice, how choreographic relationship to temporal and spatial concerns may be brought to bear in different contexts, curation being one of them. The idea of rethinking or embodying museology, so the dancer as archive, we're rethinking the idea of the museum, so Musée de la Danse being the kind of prime example of this. So really opening the door for the democratization of knowledge production and knowledge exchange. But it's also Anna de Keersmacher at her kind of 9-week exhibition recently in Brussels, where she was rethinking and deconstructing a live work in the gallery for full gallery time. And I think that work with Andresa is then thinking through to another area of possibility, which is that dance knowledge and dance thinking visible in the gallery or the museum, or perhaps accessible. So Siobhan Davies' table of contents is an example of that practice. And again, an area that I'm very interested in and wanting to explore more and research later this year. So we've arrived. It's a good moment. We're a contemporary art form. We've made it. So I can just go now. So the third part, thinking about contextualizing these ideas within a kind of critical discourse. So I want to think about Suhail Malik, who is a theorist. He's co-director of the MFA at Goldsmiths, visiting professor at Bard in New York. And I'm just drawing a little here on a series of lectures he gave, which will be brought together in a publication later this year. I'm going to quote from the description of that lecture series. So he's thinking about contemporary art's shortcomings. So contemporary art's shortcomings are increasingly evident, even with respect to its own purported ambitions, proposing alternatives to homogenizing normative conventions as method or mechanism of escape from the standardizing and conventions set by large-scale commercial, corporate, or institutionally secure forms of recognition as a site of utopian proposals, and on and on and on. He's saying that contemporary art is politically and historically inadequate. So Suhail is locating the moment of the contemporary at the ready-mades. So Duchamp's work where contemporary art, which he is proposing, this becomes the definition of contemporary art, is in its indeterminacy. So the moment a contemporary art being apparent in a work that questions and unsettles, that forces us or demands that we renegotiate the kind of terms of art, its form or its confines, that provokes us to question, is it art? So the rethinking of art becoming the definition of the contemporary. Perhaps like fashion.
it's appearing and then it's gone. So he thinks about this as becoming a fetishistic relationship to the present and the new. That's the kind of thing, the pursuit. So then contemporary art is operating as a critique. And he sees this as a shortcoming in the sense that it just becomes critique rather than the realization or the reinstitutionalization of an alternative. So a work that's questioning and unsettling, it's stimulating us to perhaps to seek to redefine the terms of art, this kind of indeterminate moment, rather than actually driving through into the reconstitution of something, an alternative, an offer. So I propose that this now has occurred for dance. So I would suggest that our ready-made was Judson Church. So the birth of the postmodern dance. Eating an apple is dance. Walking down the side of a building. But I would suggest that our coalescing as a contemporary art is in the last 5 or 6 years. By legitimization of the visual art institution. So where does this leave us? Where do we go now? We've arrived, what's next? So I've become increasingly interested by the question, when I'm making work or I'm seeing work, is it enough? It's questioning, it's unsettling, it's reforming, but is that enough? So if we briefly consider Musée de la Danse at Tate Modern, this fantastic reimagining of the museum and kind of complication of museology, democratization of knowledge, the foregrounding of the potential of embodied knowledge and thinking. The project perhaps, however, in fact, does not disrupt the institution. It's actually consumed and subsumed by the Tate. Tate was not re-institutionalized. It reconfigured Monday morning, unabated. Was it enough? So my provocation is this. Has dance's ascendance to the identity of contemporary dance, the long-fought battle, in fact resulted in its negational consumption by the visual arts, which has in turn renders its disruptive political potential impotent? Is contemporary art as questioning and reflective critique enough for Malik? The answer is no. This is not enough, and his response to that is to try and theorize an exit from contemporary art to what he calls ex-contemporary art, which he says is probably not a great term, but that's the one he's working with. And he does this in a very complex way that will probably need more time to unpack, but he describes this as a move to a negative affirmation of the artificial. So Malik, provocatively and perhaps slightly unhelpfully, does not offer any examples of what this might look like or what this might be. So today, if we take our lead from Malik, I wonder if we'd maybe try and think together about a move from contemporary art as negational art that operates as critique to being politically and historically adequate. What might that be? So I've talked about 3 things. I've talked about my work singular and its relationship to the visual art context. Secondly, I have considered the problems and tensions between dance and the visual art institution. And I propose that dance is moving from the appropriated to a point of cultural exchange through its acceptance as a contemporary art form. And lastly, or thirdly, I've drawn upon Suhail Malik's work to question whether dance's ascendance has made impotent its disruptive political potential. So in conclusion, I return to Yvonne Rainer, where we began. And in the programme note to her 1966 performance, The Mind is a Muscle, which included Trio A as a section, and many of you will know this very well, she writes, "My body remains the enduring reality." So Raina offers this statement in conclusion, as her conclusion to the recognition of what she describes as a kind of tenuous and remote connection to the world in crisis, where in horror and disbelief, she may see a Vietnamese shot dead on TV and can just turn off the television as after a bad Western. So I wonder what this enduring reality may mean now, today, when dance is so hot right now, when it's so fashionable, when it's so exciting, when it's so contemporary. Thank you.
Ladies and gentlemen, what we're going to do now is take a break for about 10 minutes. So do reconfigure the room a little bit, and then Joe will join by fellow panelists and you, the audience, to respond to the calls.
Thank you very much. I thought it would be nicer for everyone to introduce themselves, so we'll do that first. I'm Paul Russ, I'm the Artistic Director at Dance4.
I'm Sam Rose. I've got a live art and performance practice. I've been on secondment for about 5 years now from that practice to become mother. But I also run Lace Market Gallery, which is a very small gallery on Stony Street as part of an FE institution in Nottingham.
I'm Martin Hargreaves. I'm a writer, dramaturg, and performer, I guess, for the purposes of our discussion. In relationship to Raven Row, I was the coordinator of the performance program as part of the Von Rayner Raven Row exhibition, and I was a performer.
And of course we've already met you, Joe. But do you want to say anything else?
I'm Eva Rothschild, I'm a sculptor, and I've been working with Joe on developing a collaborative work, hopefully for next year. And I briefly danced in his out in that dance as well, much to the embarrassment of one of my children.
And I'm Alex Fox, and I'm the director here at Notting Contemporary.
Thank you, Alex. It's always a real thrill to be in this space, but I've never been in this space and somehow on show, or not necessarily knowing I'm on show. So it's quite an interesting perspective to have this evening. But there's so much to unpack, and there's so much richness in what you've proposed, Joe, that I'm not sure we'll all find solutions in the next 40 minutes or so, but hopefully we can have a conversation together that takes us nearer to a future. And one of the starting points for me, well, what I'm interested in, maybe unpacking a little bit, was really the assumption that we've arrived and that there is genuine exchange. And I just wondered whether, as a panel, we feel that is present and that is the place we're now in. So almost in a way to start back saying, is that really the case?
Well, I'd like to respond because you used the Von Rayner show as a kind of moment, and I think Von Rayner herself would take issue with the idea that we're suddenly arriving now, because I think there's a moment where her work in the early 1960s, her dance work is already contemporary. I mean, Andy Warhol in Popism goes to see Terrain, which we reconstructed diagonal from, and says it's the most modern thing he's ever seen in a kind of typical Warhol fashion. So there's a sense in which, in that moment, dance and choreography is very much speaking to and being spoken back to by the other contemporary arts practices. So I think it's another moment. I don't think it's the moment. And there's something about that show in which, of course, it's a different kind of work because she's already legitimate. So we can go and we can be fairly confident that this is important work. So we don't need to worry about understanding its provocation in some way because we understand it through a historical frame. So it's kind of a peculiar contemporary moment that is also a historical moment that has a sense of nostalgia around it as well. I think something I spoke about in Sarah Wilkie's book is that I have a strange nostalgia I've noticed for a period before I was born where I think some kind of connection between visual arts and dance happened. But I agree, there's something happening now, another moment of discussion. So I think we're arriving, but it's another arrival. There are a series of arrivals, and we have to pay attention to what that arrival is, and when it becomes another departure.
And how are the issues different this time around?
Economics are different. I think if you think of who went to see Terrain in 1963 at Judson Church, it was predominantly a downtown New York scene. There wasn't really any economic gain to be had from making work. It was cheap to live in New York, which is something unthinkable now. It was cheap to produce work, and that's not the case when we put on a show at Raven Row. It's very expensive because the dancers have to live, they have to give up all of the part-time jobs that sustain them. As working dancers, they have to really commit to that work for a period of time. Yvonne needs to be paid because she needs to live. And the conditions under which work emerges are completely different.
And don't you think the spaces of production and space between the practices and the inspiration that artists and choreographers had on each other and musicians had with them was closer back in the 60s? And do you see that happening again? I mean, obviously your dialogue is an example of that, but are the artists themselves getting closer together, as well as the institutions wanting to kind of fall in love with each other's art forms and share its context?
I think that artists will always fall in love with each other's practices and hate each other's practices, and I think that what's happened now that's different than the period you're talking about, which I think we're probably all guilty of romanticising. I mean, to me that seems an incredibly utopian, magical moment where everyone was sort of freely creating, is, I think, the level of self-consciousness we bring to our practice now, and the level of sort of structure around it, like the fact that we're sitting on this stage here, even though there's only like twice as many people, or 3 times as many people out there. I think that those kind of structures make it feel more strained in some way. And I think that there was the sort of benefit at that moment, which I think is something my generation is very guilty of looking at, of like the idea that it was a sort of completely unfettered, open exchange. I mean, when I look at that milieu of that moment in New York, you just imagine it was all kind of, hey, let's make a dance performance together, you know, whereas now it's like, well, we'll have a meeting at this time and we'll email this person, and then, okay, well, you do this and you do that, you know, and it sort of becomes like quite formalized or something, whereas in actual fact, to get those things done, there will have had to have been a degree of organization which we don't see. But I think that the idea of it being contemporary at that moment, I think, is very true. That was a really important moment. And I think when I look at that moment, it's almost the contemporary and sort of momentary, real lived nature of that time that I actually envy or want to sort of make real again. And that's a sort of romantic idea, I realise. And I think that some of the sort of collaborations I've seen, or that I'm aware of, that are happening now, which I've become much more aware of since working with Joe, obviously, for me there is a sense that people want to engage, and the institutions exist differently than they did at that moment. So that has changed, but I think the desire for performers to enter into something that seems contemporary and present and really located in that moment does feel very pertinent to this moment in time. And I see it with sort of, you know, a group of younger artists who I'm aware of who I've known a lot since they were students. There seems to be a real sense of this wanting to collaborate, wanting to do things together, wanting to cross things. And also, I think one of the things that's really interesting in relation to sort of performative work and what Joe's calling the visual art, which I didn't realise in a way that this sort of anxiety was as present, probably because I'm quite insular in my practice, is how I think in many ways visual artists in some way, you know, maybe it's having your cake and eating it or whatever, admire and want something that is the lack of commodification that comes with a live performance, because the commodification element is so, I mean, sure, it's a great way to make a living if that occurs for you, but it's a kind of taint as well. And the idea of these sort of huge corporate galleries, and, you know, it sort of makes, it can affect production in a way that can make the idea of the sort of present performance very sort of pure and real and in the moment. I don't know if that answers or brings anything to bear on what you're saying.
It kind of your response moves into the question problematic around conditions of reception. So in the art world, meaning in the visual art world, we somehow, maybe particularly as curators, feel we have the right to see 100 things in an hour, even 1,000 things.
Yeah.
We've got Basel Art Fair on right now.
Yeah.
And we were joking in a break, and you were saying to Joe, I don't know what you want from us. That's the kind of attention. And it's wanting to kind of, this desire perhaps on your part and other visual arts part to kind of slow things down, to create a situation of commitment where someone's not just walking by something, is important. But there's of course a flip side to that.
Well, I think the flip side is, I suppose, a collaboration, but then that's a kind of positive. It's not a negative thing. It's like a double A side. Yeah? If anyone's old enough to know that reference. But I think the different conditions for the reception of live art and what can we call it, dead art, I don't know, static art, define so much of your sort of emotional engagement with it as well. With sort of visual art, in some ways it exists in a very privileged sphere where there's a sort of reverent attitude to it, but actually so much of the engagement of the viewer is, especially in art institutions, is mediated through text, through audio guides, through kind of trying to bring this live explanatory element into it rather than a pure kind of interaction with the work. Whereas with a sort of performed work, there isn't the same assumption. It's more that you come and you engage with it and you develop your awareness of it over time. I think particularly with a piece like Singular, where for everyone involved, how it evolves is unclear. We don't know. So there's a sort of continuous looking that becomes necessary. Whereas, I mean, I've seen people come to shows, exhibitions, and look through the door and leave. And they wouldn't say they hadn't seen that exhibition, they would say they had seen the exhibition,
But the flip side is that, say for us, or for you as a visual artist, that viewing experience is slowed right down and therefore enriched, and you get away from ATD. But comparatively, that's still a very distracted kind of spectatorial commitment from a performance or dance point of view. And I guess this is really emphasized by Musée de la Danse, where you would chance, where it's a kind of promenade experience for the visitor. And you could go in and out of works. And in the same way, I thought, really intelligently, the works were going in and out of themselves. They were beginning, they were fully on. They would stop. There was, when a dancer was taking a break, they were taking a break in that same space. They would step outside a piece and mediate it for you and occupy the mediative space of the institution. In that sense, I think it really did transform the museum for 48 hours. But perhaps, could you, coming from the other side of the...
I've really enjoyed hearing Eva's thoughts on the audience in dance in the theatre, and I mentioned it actually with a talk with Rosemary Butcher for Not Dance, the Bow Hunt Gallery, which was Eva talking about her envy of the theatre audience, that we've got this audience who are potentially trapped. They always get out. You've got them for an hour or two in this kind of contract of attention, ostensibly. And that I really enjoyed, in a way, the challenge or the provocation of thinking in that way. But what I've noticed has been my experience is often, and maybe it's different with Musée de la Danse because it was so, perhaps not with the Expo Zero, but with the works that were situated around the gallery, it may not be the case, but often I think when you place dance in a gallery, then it really does slow things down. And we noticed when we had the show at the ICA that people would actually come and sit for extended periods of time, even a couple of hours. And
I'm again quite interested in that, but in a way that speaks to some of my interest in. This is a ridiculous thing to say. This is for the book Who Cares. It's actually I realise it's the first thing I kick off with. I say, I'm not sure I'm that interested in galleries, or was actually about a kind of a middle space, and I referenced this space because I think it's really exceptional in that way, and also different project spaces, maybe even take tanks, where what's happening is that we're not in the black box and we're not in the white cube. We have this potential of having a dialogue and coming together, and the way those different concerns and, in a sense, those kind of different histories and canons are agitating each other. And that for me does present, I do think of that as a kind of site of exchange. And maybe with Musée de la Danse, where that 48 hours did realise a kind of reconstitution, I thought it was interesting. I think about Expo Zero as different or as distinct, because it was this, in a way, the gallery the gallery space with 10 or 12 artists who were there, in a way, conceiving the work live in relation to the audience. I think people really did stay. When works were located around the space, I felt like it did give it an opportunity just to walk by. And also that in a way there were two institutions happening. They weren't integrating, but we had the people who were there for finding the dance, and the people there who were there to see the work on the walls and what's this thing getting in the way, which I thought was interesting, you know, and of course we could speak extensively about
I think
that.
they began morphing in very interesting ways.
Did you?
And
yeah,
and I think also that there were two, particularly with the 20 dances for the 20 dances for the 20th century. I think what was so smart about that was, to refer back to your point about at times dancers of choreographers have been expected to illustrate an artwork.
Yeah.
Instead, these were two archives situated together. And of course, the art historical archive, which we're very used to seeing in a museum, is what it's for, provided this kind of great machine for thinking about, well, what is the archive of dance in a truly danced sense, which was, a set of questions I think that the Rainer Cellar show was dealing with in juxtaposing both video documentation and actual performances through your transmission, I think was your term for it, right?
Yeah, I didn't transmit them, but yes, through transmission from somebody who, Pat Catterson, who had these dances, most of them in her body, and then she transmitted them, and then she became one of the performers for 20 dances for the 20th century. And it's this idea, you mentioned Lepecki, he talks about a will to archive in dance, and the idea that the body contains an archive that is, we can't refuse it just because it might not be authentic, or it might shift over time because of memory. It's a very important way in which we think through the archive of the 20th century. And this, I think, links to your provocation that a shift into a museum or gallery gives us a more of a critical edge in contemporary dance, and I think that has been the case because it asks the question, what is the context for this work, or what is the history for this work? So it says, where is the archive, where is the history behind this? It's not just saying, what is this contemporary moment? It's not condemning those actually to being the contemporary moments. It's saying actually this contemporary moment arrives because of a history, because of a context, because of the bodies of the performers, but also the bodies that they are storing in themselves and reanimating. So I think Sharmatz's work is particularly emblematic of that shift to asking a question, what might the museum offer us? And it might offer us an evaluation of a century of modern dance, and saying, okay, we can't just keep producing the new spectacle. We're not actually just being the contemporary moment. And I think the Agamben reference is actually that the Agamben says that the contemporary arrives when it can speak about itself. So the contemporary is always out of joint. It's always in some ways reflecting upon itself. And contemporary dance often doesn't. So I would say, for example, when a producer puts artists together, so when, at Sadler's Wells, when they have Akram Khan, Sidi Labij-Kawi and Anthony Gormley do a collaboration, it's not contemporary at all, in a way. It's just yet another assembly of names to produce a new spectacle. It doesn't actually ask any questions about that collaboration or problematize the histories that come together in that moment. It's yet another production. But then I think the questions that you're asking when you encounter each other's work, push them together, this is something that is saying, how can we be contemporary to each other and ask questions about when sculpture meets dance.
And how the things can come together and not create necessarily some kind of hybrid. It's like how they can come together and retain their own identities. And also I think there's a tension around that in like, how do you create a sort of equality between them? Or how do you create moments of inequality? Because that really interests me. I mean, for me, the fear in working with the body is that nobody looks at the sculpture. It becomes a backdrop or a set, and that's not something I desire, not in this context and not in the context of what we're doing. And equally, I suppose for you, you have your own anxieties then about, well, there's all these objects, what happens with them, and
being the decoration.
Are you sort of illustrating or animating them, or stroking them, or and there's all these kind of cliches that can be played out. But how do you arrive at something that isn't those things, where something doesn't become a prop or a set or sort of a trinket, or and I think that.
But we're told objects have ontologies now.
So
that's also been very fashionable in the last few years. Is there some sense of a potential uncanny life of your objects?
Well, I always think they have a life, but that's body. My own problem, I think that there is a sort of bizarre kind of relation to a sort of I suppose a sort of animistic kind of nature, I suppose. But I think that because like I say, we've done this initial thing now with Fig 2 and Block at the ICA, and that was its own event, and it had these sort of separate but joined practices. Now how we develop something actually in tandem or in exchange, as Joe says, is a kind of whole different sort of world of making. Which is how I would like to view it. Where it leads to, I don't know yet. But I think that it shouldn't be that one illustrates the other.
So for you are objects performative in that sense, both objects and bodies. So rather than objects like in the early 20th century, some costume designed by Picasso for choreography and being very much at the service, which is equivalent to this sort of dance illustrating an artwork. Do you, and Jason, is your response to Eva's work, is it, and if it's on the same level, is it kind of assuming that the object is also a performative thing as well as the body?
Can I answer that? I don't see the object as performative at the point where it is finished. But so much of what goes into making the object is about the body, that I feel that sort of doesn't get removed fully from the object. So there's a sort of presence of the body kind of in the object.
But it performs in space, surely, as did minimalist sculpture, and hence a move to dialogue with choreographers, and yours in particular, playing with gravity and all these things we actually associate with a moving body, and dancers think about all the time.
Yeah, I suppose in that sense it does. And I think that the audience kind of makes it maybe performative, and they become performative in relation to it, in terms of how they move and how they approach the objects. Or move, because obviously, I suppose in a way you choreograph the space, as Joe said, because you think about how somebody might be here and how somebody might be there and how that would look with this. And so there is a sense of a sort of journey or a kind of preferred mode of looking that you sort of I guess design into your making. So in that sense, yes, I suppose there is.
Sam, did you?
I was just going to say, we're talking about very big institutions, art institutions here, and I'm coming from the perspective of talking about much smaller spaces. And I was just going, whilst you were talking about your kind of discomfort with the sculpture being ignored, what I found really interesting, certainly wasn't, I don't think, a collaborative exchange, but Hourglass at Backlit created a really interesting dialogical relationship. Sally Doty responding to the exhibition, but within the dance was a dialogical relationship with the objects, which I found really, you couldn't separate the exhibition from the dance. It was a cohesive piece of work, even to the point that she was having a conversation with the video installation. I was just responding to the idea that the sculpture might be ignored, and how dancers can work with these static objects in a more dialogical way, so that they're not separate. I mean, certainly this isn't separate from the dance at all. This moves and mutates, and for me this is kind of a perfect collaborative sculptural movement-based work in terms of exchange.
And how much of this work is then reliant, for the person spectating, if there was no live body, how much then of the live body is present? I then start to think about it, make the viewer body was important in the making of that work, or is the body is present now?
And we're always thinking of the absent body, because the body has to depart at some point, doesn't it? Unless it's
I think with the piece we did at the ICA, in a way, that's what we wanted, was that the body never departed. It was there the whole time the space was open, so the sculptures and the performers were occupying the same time frame.
Okay.
Right.
And that was really kind of important to that work, that it was...
For a week, right?
It was
it
three sort of 6-hour periods. So it was like the doors are open, everything's in there. The doors close, it's finished. So there wasn't a sort of beginning or an ending, other than it being bounded by the time. And I think that was really important to both of us. And actually, in a way, that felt like one of the kind of really key points. It wasn't like, here's some stuff, and at this time and this time and this time, these events will occur. They couldn't be separated. They had to be together. And that was, I think, really, well, for me, was really important, because it meant that it wasn't occupying a kind of an arc or anything. It just was constant, which is how an exhibition is.
Right, it's exhibition time.
Yeah,
and maybe that would be really good to throw it back to you as dancers, choreographers, is thinking around exhibition time. I mean, obviously there are huge practical and financial issues around exhaustion and pay and so on, but if we just park those for a second, what does to what extent does exhibition time interest you? And I think there's an obvious link back to the spectator, in that the spectator visual arts is usually free to edit an experience, the beginning and end, even with a video. They'll sit and watch the first part of the loop if they arrive halfway through. Could you talk about that time, and to what extent you're interested in occupying it, or if you find it problematic and it's something you want to refuse and actually occupy, beginning and end temporal situations, but in a neutral space like this, it's neither encoded by the visual arts or theatre.
I mean, I think when you mentioned Tino Segal, and he now doesn't identify with choreography or theatre because he fully occupies the time of the gallery, and I think for him, the way that, and I think this is also Dorothea von Hantelmann's take on it, that there's a shift from the theatre as an institution, as a temporal proposition, to come collectively as an audience, to identify temporarily as an audience, and to recognize the separation between you and the artwork for an agreed contracted moment of time, and then leave together. and his shift over into the gallery is really to say, well, what does the museum and the gallery propose? It's an individual can come and can come back again and enter at any moment into a work, go away and come back. And there's this different kind of proposition. So that's why for him, I think, because I was a performer for him in, he doesn't even call them you performers, but for the Tate work, for these associations. But when that happens, I think you can't really park the question of exhaustion and time and expense, because also that shift over into museum time sometimes doesn't take into account the time that is not apparent in the museum, which is the production time, it's the rehearsal time, it's everything that comes before then, which in my experience of working with galleries, they're not really used to that because they don't generally they don't fund the production of a work. They buy in a work or they collect a work. I mean,
they do sometimes.
They do sometimes.
Yeah, they do have to say
they do sometimes, but it's
that often.
But it's not that they provide rehearsal space or that they would give a wage
or provide studio time or
yes.
anything. Yeah, you have to have your studio. And you have to,
So
it's rare something is made on site.
Sometimes it is. So it is a really interesting question. It's predominantly about time, both time of the artist and of the production time of the artwork, but then also the time of the spectator, who comes and doesn't identify as an audience. They come as an individual, they come and they have a specific relationship, and they may also think to return to it. I mean, we did have people, the Yvonne Rainer show was somewhere in between, because we did have announced times of performances. They weren't continuous, and they couldn't be continuous. And also they had a front, you couldn't walk around them, they weren't object-like, even though that was one of the qualities of the work, it wasn't the actual situation of the work. So I think there's lots of questions around that shift that have to do with time, but I don't think you can ever park economics.
No, okay.
Yeah.
Well, sure. I mean, Tina Segal saying it has to be as long as any other exhibition, despite that.
Yeah. And it's free.
Bodies there.
Yeah, and it's free.
And it's free to enter, and that was also a stipulation of Boris Sharmat's for Musée de la Danse. We only ever occupied the free parts of Tate Modern, not the galleries you have to pay to go into, because he was interested in this idea that people might come and then go and then come back, so that you don't enter into that economic contract and feel obliged to
thank you,
receive
BMW.
something from that. Yes.
But also, I mean, in terms of the economy as well, something like the Tina Segal piece, in terms of sort of budgets, can only have, regardless of how many performers, can only have been on a par of the budget needed to make, say, the Ai Weiwei piece, or I mean, I don't know, you may have more information about those budgets, I don't know, but, you know, there's considerable, you know, there's any project like that, there will be a budget, you know, and there will be fundraising. So I don't see that it's different to pay, I don't know how many performances it was, 200 over a period of time, than it is to produce, you know, a massive artwork that will then be dismantled and.
Sure. It's just
there's a different desire and a different way of thinking about it, and a different sense of value and a different.
But it's also with the visual art show generally, if it doesn't involve performance in any way, the longer you leave it up, the better value it is.
Yeah, there's that.
That's why exhibitions get longer and longer as revenue funding gets tighter and tighter. Well, it's the exact opposite.
But conversely, in commercial galleries, they get shorter and shorter.
Exhibition time. But that's because they're flogging more and more, and more and more active art market.
But it's also because the site, you know, because there's all these off-site things which are essentially art fairs and things like that. So that is a kind of interesting thing in relation to the museum as opposed to the commercial space.
I just had a thought on the kind of temporal frame as well, is that I'm presenting a work that lends itself to that context, and some works won't or don't, and they maybe are engaging more with the kind of sense of theatrical time, and that's been an interesting question for me to think about how they might relocate in different contexts. One work I made, I was really interested in bringing what I would call maybe kind of durational or gallery time into the theatre, and there's a kind of very extended period where not much happened in a way, and it didn't have that kind of arc of the kind of crafting the theatrical frame. But I think an artist called Martin Spanberg, who provokes in every way possible, is doing something quite interesting in this way, that he's making these 3-hour pieces. They don't quite sit anywhere, in a way.
Opera.
Well, it's too short for opera.
Sorry, you go ahead.
I was just, in terms of how dance sits or is placed within a conventionally, read visual arts gallery, the potential for dance to exist in so many different ways is there, and this notion that it kind of disrupts and destabilizes is really interesting to me. I suppose because I'm from a live art and performance background myself, it doesn't kind of shock me to see bodies in a gallery in any way. But I'll just recount the conversation I was having before you joined us in the bar. I was with an architect friend. We were with our children looking at the gallery exhibition upstairs, and we came down to the cafe and stumbled across, what was the piece called?
The Body.
The Body.
By Joe. Yeah.
I didn't know it was here. We both stumbled across it. And it did, because it was an incidental meeting, it did disrupt. At that time, there were 2 dancers just out there, and the space was filled with chairs and bodies and a soundtrack. And I think the way that you were talking earlier about the reception of the work, and I think different audiences will receive works differently depending on what they're used to seeing. But certainly, the person I was with, we stayed with the work for a while, and she wept, throughout the whole piece, because she's not used to having that bodily, emotive response to moving to the soundtrack. And I'm rambling now. I was talking about how dance can exist in different ways, to disrupt and destabilize these kind of conventional notions of what we do within a gallery and how we move around a gallery space. But I don't see why dancers can't be upstairs as well. And I'm really interested in why we don't see bodies moving throughout the galleries as well. I know it happens, but it's generally, it's as far as I'm aware, and through my experience of coming here, it's generally very, it's related to the artist in the gallery and an extension of their practice.
Yeah.
And I'm really interested in what happens when dancers kind of destabilize that choreographed audience. We move around a gallery. We have some galleries are designed that we move in a particular way through a space. We pause. We move on. And I think there's such potential for this notion of the choreographed space to have bodies in it as well, and to relate to those bodies that are already choreographing their way through. And I think sometimes for me to separate, I think this space is awesome as well. It's a really amazing space, but I think there's potential for more disruption and destabilization if you put it inside the gallery as well. And I think as a curator, it must be really, you kind of have this frame and you want it to make sense to the actual exhibition, but it doesn't have to make sense.
Well,
sometimes.
I think my kind of response to this would be that I think it works where something alongside something as an intervention that is historically in a different context. I think it's difficult when the work is new by a living artist and there's no deliberate relationship made between the two. It doesn't have to be unequal, as we've discussed, but I think it's odd if the artwork is new for the dance to be seen as a disruption of it. I mean, why wouldn't what the artist is doing be disruptive anyway?
I don't mean a disruption of the artwork. I
Right.
mean a disruption of the conventions of the space or something like that. you know.
But the artist is working with those things already. So those things are not, as soon as an artist is working in a space, they're, those, particularly if they're a kind of self-reflexive and critical artist, they would be dealing with that already. So, but we can stay on that, but...
I'm just really aware of time. Really boring job.
Could I just say one?
But
But equally, Alex, I mean, for me, the best way to resolve that issue would be, I could imagine, because obviously you have to respect people's practice. So, I mean, I would say that I couldn't see a reason why somebody couldn't curate a group show in which there's 3 visual artists, 2 dancers, and a photographer, and a musician, and they could be given an equal weight. So, and I think that is a good model. I don't see why that doesn't occur more.
Well, we did that at the Hayward, so it was something.
Yes.
So I'm not Nicola Conybeare, even if you've come to see her. I'm here in her stead. But I collaborated with her and Frank Bock to form Volume Project, and we were one of the invited artists to represent what was happening in London for this for Mirror City at the Hayward. It was still challenging because we had very different demands to everybody else in the show. Once they installed, most of the other artists go.
I think that's a
we
really
needed
good
a stage
model.
manager. We needed somebody to actually take. I mean, it's to go back to what Alex said. Once something goes up, they don't really have to invest very much money into the upkeep of the show. With us, actually, as soon as the show started, then that's when we needed to be taken care of even more. And it comes back to this question, actually, of the evacuation of politics from dance. And I think the politics is to be found in the insistence of the body's makeup that we need to be taken care of.
I find in the book, actually, this is really interesting, in Sarah's book, reading it today on the train, this phrase, taken care of, came up all the time. We did this show, we were taken care of really well. We did this, they took care of us really well. We weren't taken care of, we were taken care of. As a visual artist, this doesn't cross my mind, obviously you go places, you have a great experience, you go places maybe people aren't so, but basically, you come and you go, and so you don't have an extended experience, perhaps, of what it is like to inhabit that space in the same way. So there is a different engagement with both the, sort of personally with the institution you're working with people on the ground, and that relationship of respecting the work in relation to respecting the body and the performer. I think, for me, I've really grown to understand how crucial that is and how much that affects the nature of any outcome in this kind of practice.
Absolutely. And on that point then, I'm just wondering whether we take care of the people in front of us and invite them to offer their perspective or ask questions of the panel. Yes?
I was just thinking, you're talking about the audience a lot. Very kind of up-to-date research we've just had. I work in a museum and a gallery, and I work in consortium with theatres as well. There's a very clear split between why audiences come to our institutions and audiences come to theatres for entertainment. Is the number one thing they say they go for, and they say that they come to museums for pedagogy and learning, inspiration, to find things out about themselves. So in terms of the politics of dance, it makes sense to me it has to be in the museum. If you want people to learn from it and be politically engaged, put it in an institution which the audience themselves relate with learning, politics, and pedagogy. So I suppose maybe you could say something about that relationship to the audience where you're working with their expectations before they even turn up in pushing dance forward or creating an archive for a museum of dance. Like, the museum is a very different institution to the theatre. If it's the audience thinks they go there to learn, how can that shift how you work with dance in the space?
Yeah, I agree. I think, so we've been talking a lot about Boris Sharmat, and actually very few dance producers and programmers would touch him because they thought it was too conceptual and not, the audiences wouldn't, they often had a conversation with a London-based programmer who wouldn't program him when the rest of Europe was programming him, because our audiences won't understand it, because it's an idea that they would come not wanting to engage in the activity of understanding, which I think was actually perhaps underestimation of what dance audiences want. Whereas actually then the White Cube programmed him years ago, and there's an understanding that a gallery that went to the White Cube would want to try and understand this work. They wouldn't just want to come and be entertained. So I think that certainly exists. Perhaps not. I think dance audiences, in my experience, dance audiences are actually that they are much more intelligent than they're given credit for, and they're inquisitive and really want something. But I think at the level often of production and programming, certainly historically, there's been a fear that difficult experimental work that deals with itself, conceptualizes itself, or deals with its own generation and its history, is somehow too much for an audience that just wants, Hoffe-Schechter, just wants a big spectacle of people dancing. So I agree there's that differentiation, but I don't think it's necessarily, I know there's been surveys of audiences as well, but I think sometimes that's given also as an excuse not to put on work in theatres. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Do you think there's having knowledge of those spaces can produce a kind of, a new approach to political dance within museums or dance interpretation? Like, I don't go to see very much dance, but there's never a huge amount of interpretation like there is in art galleries. So is there new opportunities around those understandings of the different institutions?
By interpretation, you mean the ways in which an institution might facilitate an engagement with the work that you... Okay, yeah. I guess often, one of the modes that theatres use is a post-show discussion, or maybe something like this, which is not post or pre, it's sort of part of or adjacent to a performance, but it's not interpretive text on the wall, and it's not a catalogue. It is that issue, and I think maybe there's something about really trusting that audiences will want to stay for a post-show discussion, or will want to come on another day and have a discussion about certain kinds of work. And it's partly also to do with the fact that, as I said before, it's an audience, it's not a spectator. It's a group of people that will come together at maybe only once for one moment and see something. And so how do you deal with the heterogeneity of that audience? You don't want to patronize some. You can't actually teach them before they see a work. When we go to a gallery, we can choose what we read, when we want to read it, how that interpretation relates to the work itself. So, Sadler's Wells doesn't have an interpretation department, and I don't think it should do. Whereas, the Tate does, because that's how they see the facilitation of an individual visitor, how they can choose their pathway through the gallery.
I think also we could go on at length about this, I'm sure, but there's something for me also about the UK and its relationship to dance and its relationship to choreography, and the notion of something being disabling and anarchic, and that ultimately not feeling something, particularly when running an institution that's publicly funded, how very much that then acts as an immediate barrier to entering into a much more complex and interesting dialogue with an audience about work. Is there one more question we might have from the floor before we bring this to a close? Yes.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah, I think picking up on the previous point, I really enjoyed the presentation from Joe, and I'm just curious what you said about the sort of loss of a sense of a certain level of political agency or effectiveness or potential loss in stepping into the visual arts world. And I was just wondering if there was another way of reading that, because it seems to me that the visual arts in its sort of traditional mode, let's say static object, moving observer, operates a bit like a traditional theatre setting, but the other way around. Mobile work, static viewer, static observer. Both of them, in a sense, operate beyond, the work is sort of beyond the proscenium in a way, so there's an immediate kind of barrier, disjunction between audience and work. And that stepping and by taking performance into the visual arts realm feels like potentially both have something to gain, in the sense that that movement breaks immediately for both forms, if you like, breaks that barrier of the proscenium. And then that kind of engagement that I think we've just been touching on between the observer and the work, in a way that they both gain some political effectiveness out of that move, rather than just a loss in one direction. Wonder whether you might...
Joe, you talk about the dancer thinking through the gallery in Sarah's interview with you. You say how the dancer can think through the gallery, and I guess, you know, it's about an exchange of how the gallery can think through the dancer as well. So it links to what you're saying, where we kind of...
Yeah, I think, I mean, in a way that's my provocation, to think about, or to invite others thinking on. I think the way you're framing that is really interesting, that two mobile elements coming together. And I think my thought there is in a way this question of when dance maybe re-emerges, if you like, as the contemporary art form in the way that is happening now, or in the way that was being experienced in the 60s. Is it kind of then sentenced to this negational space where, in a way, everything can be consumed, everything can be...
Yeah, because I think this is the kind of concern, because the art world is voracious. I mean, and I think it's like you know, capitalism. It's like it can absorb whatever comes its way. It can absorb it, and it can absorb it. And I think the fashion world is like that. It can absorb difference. It can absorb, it's cultural appropriation. And I think that when I'm saying that, I don't necessarily mean that in a negative. I mean, it can be negative, and I think that that's a sort of danger, maybe. But, or not danger, that's overstating it. You know, we're not talking about lives, but a risk to artistic intent or expression. But I think that the nature of, I suppose, art, I just think it would be better to look at it as a totality rather than all the separation, because I think that visual art sort of can encompass everything, but yet you kind of need, there's a sense of a need to keep an identity without it all just becoming absorbed. And I don't know where that leaves. I think, like, say, the Boris Sharmat's at the Tate was amazing, fantastic. To me, it seemed very successful in every way, both in terms of being there, in terms of what it did and introducing things to people. But it's like, it's really important that that retains its own identity as well, you know, and I think that it doesn't sort of become just a facet of... It's like, you know, things can colonize each other so easily, and in where I think that works, it becomes an exchange, and where it doesn't work, it neutralizes, you know, the potency of things. And I think that is, you know, as well for me, like as a sculptor, you know, things come up that are maybe about design or about fashion, and I always have a slight, I'm not sure, because I see those things can absorb and neutralize, and so we want to collaborate, but yet we have a sort of protective sense of our own form, and that, I think, is a concern for all of us travelling into each other's areas.
Maybe also something, I think we could talk again at length about this, but something about the notion of dance still feeling homeless. It's that notion has been very present in many conversations over recent years about we're maybe really concerned about our practice because there isn't necessarily something which has held it as our home, as a place that we make, we share, and we inhabit in the same way that, you know, other forms seem to have been afforded for many, many years.
I think that's true.
But being a migrator is also a very productive
It's what we
and
do
quite
very
radical
Well,
position
I
to
think
be
that is a
in.
radical position, but it's a hard position to
It
be
is,
in.
yeah.
You know,
It is.
definitely.
Yeah. But full of possibility, and that's probably where we should draw it to a close, I think. So it just leaves me to thank Martin, Sam, Alex, Eva, and Joe. Thank you very much for providing provocation and being present this evening. And now I'm going to be handing over to
Helga
Stuart, who's
and
going to just
Rosalind.
say what's happening next. Thank you very much.
Just briefly to round up the session, we talked, Joe talked earlier, and the panel have talked about Sarah's book, Who Cares, which was launched yesterday at Siobhan Davis Studios in London. So just to come and share some of her findings, her conversations with people, a little sales pitch. The book is available to buy out there, so I'll do that bit for you. It would be great for you to come and also share your thoughts. Thank you.
Is this on? Okay. Thank you, Stuart. Thanks. I guess I'll just stand over here. It's very apropos to be here. It's great, and the timing's really fantastic. I'm going to look at my notes. I've never done a sales pitch for a book before. I'm a choreographer and a dance artist, so I'll contextualize myself in that way. And I realized I've been working in galleries and museums for probably about 20 years, and mainly because I was working in the U.S., in the States, where there aren't probably as many theater spaces for dance. So I remember even in college seeking gallery spaces to show work. So these are spaces I've kind of been working in for many, many years. And this book project, which is in collaboration with Siobhan Davies Dance, came out of my experiences mainly at Raven Row, which was mentioned, working for Yvonne. And not only at Raven Row, but doing Yvonne's repertoire work in many galleries and museums internationally. So I started to think about the communication that happens or that doesn't happen between curators and dance artists when working in these spaces. And I started to have a conversation with Kate Coyne at Siobhan Davies Dance about that last summer. And she said she was thinking about some of the same things with her dance artist mentorship scheme that she was running through Siobhan Davies Dance. And curators and dance artists together at the table who've worked on projects together. And I said, kind of what Joe alluded to earlier, there have been so many live events about this subject, and we could do another one, and this is fantastic. Not to say that they aren't valid, I mean, they're absolutely necessary, but I became really interested in something more permanent as an object that could be both an archive of what's happening right now in the UK in particular, to sort of sort of track and to put down some of the ways people are thinking about dance in the galleries and museums, so that 5 years from now we could look back on it and say what was happening in this moment, because a lot of the fear is this could be a passing trend. Maybe in 10 years dance is no longer in the gallery and museum. So I felt it was really important, or maybe it is, but it's changed, and something to look back on and say, this is what was going on, this is what we were thinking about. So if you bear with me, I'm just going to check my notes. Because we had the launch yesterday, and I got to say thank you, but I didn't get to say much about what this book means for me, and that was a question someone came up and asked me at the launch, and I thought, this is an opportunity to sort of talk about that. I think for me, the who cares, that kind of provocative question, which at first can sound quite cynical, is actually the opposite of that. It really is what emerged through the conversations, and Martin's in the book as well as Joe, and this word care, as you alluded to earlier, continued to pop up. And not just how do we care for dancers and dance artists, but how do we care for the artworks and the objects, and how do we care about the architectural space of the museum? Hugo Worthy, who's here, is also in the book, and he talked about taking care of the floor of his gallery space when one of the artists wanted to wear flamenco shoes. So this notion of care, and Alex Sainsbury from Raven Row talked about how he deeply cares about that space, and he actually, during the Raven Row show, had three amazing apartments in the building in which dance artists stayed in while they were international artists. I think Yvonne stayed in one and Pat stayed in one. That he actually really cares about the building, and it is a kind of domestic space where he houses people. So I think care came through that way. Also, I think going back to the sort of archiving of this moment, there's this amnesia that I think happens in two ways. One, I compare dance in the museum as putting on a big wedding, I have not done one myself, but I have been to them and I've talked to people who have done them, or with any big event, right? It's sort of in going into preparing this event. Everyone's all excited and gung-ho and getting along, and then as you're preparing to do it, all these problems come up and it's stressful and people are like, why are we doing this? And then the event happens and everyone has a great time and drinks lots of wine, and then it's over and everyone forgets about all of the problems. It was just one great experience. And I think, well, that's been my experience as a dance artist in museums, galleries, is great idea, lots of problems, fantastic event. Everyone goes off and does their next project and never actually has an evaluation of what happened or a discussion or kind of reflection, which I think is where the kind of good stuff starts to come out, where you can kind of step forward and say, the next time we do this, we'll do it this way. So I wanted to sort of look at, in reflection, what happened. So I approached 15 individuals, half were curators, half were curators and directors, half dance artists, but I think Martin and Frank kind of slipped in between somewhere as, I think I called you once a broker, but we didn't really like that term, but that you're situated kind of between that communication between dance artist and curator. And I wanted to ask them, what does this mean for you? Can you talk about one project that you did and why you did it and what it means for you? So I was also wanting, I cared very deeply about the personal kind of intimate conversation. Why do you do this? What does this mean for you? And I think it's, I guess, maybe I'm wrong, I don't think curators and directors are often asked that question. I think artists are asked that question a lot. What does this mean for you? Why do you do it? On that kind of personal level. So to sit in the room with Catherine Wood talking about Musée de la Danse before it was even happening, I really got to hear sort of what it means for her to do this. And that might not be something that's generally available to the public or made visible. And so it was interesting for me, not interesting, but important for me to get in the room and have these one-to-one conversations with people and ask them, what does this mean for you? Not just what was great, what wasn't great, what didn't work, but why, the why and the how. I'm taking more than my 5 minutes, aren't I? But I'm having so much fun. Let me see if there's anything else. Yeah, and I think it's always important to say, you know, this book happened with limited time and limited budget, and it's not all inclusive. I mean, there were so many people I thought should be in the Rosemary Butcher. The list goes on and on. So there's always that risk that not everyone is in there that should be in there. And my hope is that this book is a prompt for more books to come. I got a great email from Sue Davies, and she said, when is the sequel coming out? And I had a great conversation with Alistair Spalding last night, and he came up to me and he said, where are the programmers of theaters in the discussion? Because he has a lot to say. And I thought, wouldn't that be a great follow-up book? Well, I have 5 follow-up books. I think the next follow-up book should be, and I don't want to do it, someone else take it. So the proceeds from this book are going back to Siobhan Davies Dance to support further events and conversations and potentially books around these subjects. And I think the sequels could be why, who cares, dance in the Gallery Museum. Invigilators, I think, is a voice. And that came up quite a lot. The visitors to the museum. There was one more, visitors to the museum. Dancers, because these were choreographers, and I'm also interested what dancers would say, who probably don't have a lot of conversations with the curator-director, but they're the ones who are feeling directly what works and what doesn't work in this exchange. And then I think Alistair made that great point of a prompt for what do programmers of theaters think about dance in the museum. So I'll leave it at that. Anyone can take up those ideas, run with it, and please buy a book, $7.95, affordable for all artists, and it's very colorful, and it's tactile, so you have to get it, you have to touch it, you have to feel it, you can't read it online. It's, yeah, there's a kind of design effect. Touch it, feel it. Thank you very much, thank you.
We have 3 more days of provocations and performances. Jonathan Hale, who is with us tonight, will be leading the discussion with some artists tomorrow, looking at architecture and dance in urban environments and those more community settings. And then on Saturday morning, we have a provocation.